So good evening, everyone. I'd like to welcome you to our webinar this evening on renovating pastures. Our training tonight's being put on by the Delaware Cooperative Extension, which is a joint effort of both the University of Delaware as well as Delaware State University. And also we're joined tonight by Dr. Amanda Grev, who's one of our partners over at the University of Maryland Cooperative Extension. So I'm Susan Gary. I'll be your moderator for this evening's session. And in addition to working in the livestock and equine areas for Extension and the Delaware 4-H Youth Development Program, I also graze some sheep. We breed some blackface type sheep here at home, graze some dairy steers and some dairy heifers. And so this is a topic that's near and dear to my own heart, in addition to managing our horses on pasture. So I'd like to introduce our speaker for tonight, Dr. Amanda Grev. So Amanda joined the University of Maryland Extension team in 2019 as their forage and pasture specialist. She's originally from Minnesota, and she completed her undergraduate degree at North Dakota State University. She received her MS and PhD in animal science at the University of Minnesota, where her research focused on the interaction between animal nutrition, forages, and pasture management. So she's based out of the University of Maryland's Western Maryland Research and Education Center. In addition to Amanda's extension role, she's currently working on research involving orchard grass persistence, finishing lambs on pasture, and the use of improved pasture for grazing dairy heifers. So sounds like we have a lot in common, Amanda. For those who are interested, tonight's session is worth one Delaware Nutrient Management Continuing Education credit. And so in order to receive the credit, you must, in addition to listening to and participating in the webinar, you must go to the short Qualtrics quiz that we will make available following tonight's session. Those questions must be completed no later than noon tomorrow in order to receive those credits. So I will put the link to the quiz in the chat box at the end of the session, but I will also email that link directly to everyone that registered at the conclusion of tonight's webinar. I need to tell you that we're recording this evening's session to be able to post it online as a resource for future reference. And the last bit of business before we get started with Amanda's talk is that we request that you put your questions in the chat box as we go. So we will take time to address all questions at the conclusion of our online session this evening. It's possible that we will address your questions sometime later in the presentation, and we respectfully ask that participants refrain from answering questions from other participants, as we would like to give our experts the opportunity to answer them. So without further ado, Amanda, I'm going to turn it over to you.
All right. Thanks, Susan, and thanks everybody for having me. I'm glad you were able to join us tonight. We actually have a little more in common than that, Susan. I do have a horse as well, so not on my own property, but get to work with lots of different livestock species, which is quite a fun adventure. So just as a heads up to everybody, trying to make this a little bit more interactive tonight. I know we are all connecting virtually and remotely through the internet, but I'd like to make it a little bit more interactive if possible. So if you want to participate in the interactive questions and Q&A part that I have incorporated into this presentation, you'll see at the bottom of the screen right now, it says to text my full name, Amanda Grev, 294, to the number 37607. It is a free text service that's through Poll Everywhere, and it just will allow us to basically, you text in your responses to some questions that I'll have, and it'll show everybody's responses on the slide so you can see how you compare from other people, and everything's anonymous, so you know, your name won't be associated with your answer in case you're feeling shy. So I guess I'll give everybody a minute to text that, and then I have a trial slide first with just a trial question to make sure that it's working. For anybody who would prefer to use the chat feature, that's another option. You can also use the chat feature if you would like. This will just compile all of our answers and show them on the screen for anybody who's interested in seeing what other people are thinking as well. So like Susan said, tonight we're here to talk about pasture renovation. We're going to go over kind of an overview of the renovation process, how we know when we should be renovating, if we should be renovating, and then kind of the different steps that go along with actually completing a pasture renovation. This is a very timely topic right now because fall, or the late summer fall season, is a really good time of year to be doing these pasture renovations. So with that, I will get started. Here is our first polling question. All you need to do is, once you're in the system, text your response to that number, and it should show any responses that are received on the screen if it's working, hopefully. Okay, so it is working. We have some horse people in the audience, sheep. Let's give people a minute to get their answers in. This also will help give me a little feel for who's listening and what kind of livestock you have on your farms. We know that there are differences with some of our livestock species as to, different pasture likes and dislikes. All right, so we have a good mix: sheep, goats, cattle, horses, a little bit of everything tonight. So very cool. That's good to see. And we will move on. All right, so I wanted to start off with kind of why a renovation might be needed. Really, the most important thing to realize is that an unproductive pasture is often a symptom of some sort of underlying cause. So if you respond, now you can say, what are the major causes, in your opinion, of low pasture productivity? What do you think might be a reason or a cause behind a pasture not being as productive as we would like it to be? I see pH as an answer, low pH. That's a really good answer. We'll talk about that. Depleted soils, soil fertility is another major cause. That's also a correct answer. Overgrazing is another good one. We'll talk about that. Having a monoculture species versus a variety, different nutrients. Yeah, so these are all good causes that could be a reason behind low pasture productivity. And the reason that I bring this up is because as we're having these pasture productivity problems and we're looking at doing some renovation, we really need to think what is causing those renovation problems in order to move forward with remedying that situation. So in my experience, the major causes of low pasture productivity are lack of adequate fertilization, soil pH would also be included in that, poor grazing or harvest management. We had a number of people say overgrazing, and unproductive species. So really the point behind this is to get you thinking a little bit, because if your pasture stand is thin as the result of inadequate soil fertility, overgrazed pastures, poor management, etc., weed infiltrations, the problem is not necessarily going to correct itself just because you're adding more seed to that pasture. So you really need to think about the reasons why the pasture is not being as productive as it might be, and remedy those situations before we can actually fully have a successful pasture renovation. That being said, there may be other cases where renovation might be needed. You might have inherited a new field that was previously neglected before. You may have, some problems with weather. 2 years ago, we had a really, really wet year in this mid-Atlantic region. So we had a lot of people with issues with pasture being torn up from the wet weather. So there are lots of reasons behind why renovation is needed. So once we think about maybe the root causes behind renovation, our next question is, what does renovation mean? Or how do we go about renovating a pasture? Well, really, the first and foremost goal behind renovation is to improve an existing forage stand, right? We want forages there either for hay to harvest, for grass for our livestock to graze, etc. The other thing to consider is that there are a number of different ways that we can go about accomplishing this goal. What I mean by that is renovation does not always have to mean fully, tilling up a field, reseeding, completely starting from scratch. Some of these other ways that we can improve our management can oftentimes have a really good renovating effect on a pasture. This is things like what we've just been talking about, improving our fertilization, taking care of problem weeds that might be taking over, using good grazing or good harvest management if we have a pasture or a hayfield. Those can be forms of renovation that can play a surprising role in improving an existing forage stand. And this is not in the right order here. Oh, okay, I guess it might be. So, all right, if we think about some of the things behind what a plant needs to grow, what are some things that come to mind? What does a plant need to grow or thrive? I'm thinking back to, your high school biology class, photosynthesis, nitrogen, water, oxygen, soil, nutrients from the soil, exactly. These are the essential nutrients and, air and water that a plant needs to grow and thrive and do well. So if we think about this from a biological concept or from, the photosynthetic process, when we think about what a plant needs to grow, it's exactly those things. We need light, carbon dioxide, water, and minerals from the soil to basically turn that energy into something that our livestock can utilize for a food source or a forage source. So when we think about management in this type of situation, basically we can think of these plants as little solar panels or little photosynthetic factories. They're taking that energy from the sunlight and those nutrients from the soil, and they're making a usable product that our livestock can use and provide nutrients to our livestock with. If we think about it from that perspective, where does this energy for regrowth come from? Well, it comes from one of two different places. One can be the leaf area that's remaining on a plant. We know that only these green and growing leaves can carry out photosynthesis. So if we have a field that's continuously grazed, overstocked, not very much leaf material there, those plants are going to struggle to continue to photosynthesize at a rapid rate, simply because there's not a lot of leaf area there for those plants to photosynthesize. The other source of energy for these plants comes from stored carbohydrates. So we know that our grasses store their energy reserves primarily in the stem base, so that lower 3 to 4 inches. And this is the other source of energy for those plants in terms of regrowth. So if we want to maximize the productivity under a grazing situation, we need to leave a little bit of that leaf area by leaving some residual forage and not overgrazing those fields. And this will also in turn leave some stored carbohydrates for those forages to continue to thrive. So the reason I get into this is because when we're thinking about renovation, oftentimes we jump right to reseeding. So I really wanted to emphasize that different types of management can play a big role in this as well. We know that in a continuously grazed pasture, most of the plants are grazed every 2 to 7 days. So as that plant's trying to regrow, those livestock species are coming back and nipping off that new growth and removing that photosynthetic capability of that forage. So we need to provide those forages with proper rest so that they can regenerate those carbohydrate reserves, recover quicker, and then last for a longer period of time. Just to give you a little bit of a visual of that, these are 2 plants that were kept in a greenhouse, and they were clipped on the left-hand side weekly to 1 inch, and on the right-hand side monthly to 3.5 inches. And this was done to simulate, more of a continuous grazing situation where those plants are continually grazed off close to the ground versus a rotational system where, those plants were rested and given that time period to regrow. And you can see that after clipping those plants, the picture is showing you 6 days worth of regrowth. So in just 6 days, that plant that has had that good rest period, that good amount of residual forage height, was able to regrow and respond a lot quicker than the one that is continuously overgrazed. So I just wanted to show you this because it's a really good, give you a really good feel for why some of these management strategies are important. The same thing can be said for what is happening below the ground. We know that we have repeated grazing situations, we have less root growth happening below the surface. So those plants are less drought tolerant, less able to take up nutrients, etc. That rest period allows those roots to redevelop and regrow and be able to handle some of those extreme weather conditions, injury, non-ideal situations. So similar to the last picture, you can see the differences in the above ground forage mass, but here you can also see the difference in the below ground root mass from a plant that was cut to 2 inches every week, every 2 weeks, or every 4 weeks. So just wanted to emphasize a little bit about that management and why that can be such an important thing. So getting back to renovation, all right, so we know that renovation can mean some changes in management, some improvements in the way we're grazing or we're harvesting those forages. Renovation can also come in the form of something like the establishment of legumes into grass sods. So, overseeding in some clover or frost seeding in some clover into a pasture that, maybe getting a little bit thinner or needs a little bit of a boost can provide that boost in forage quality, can fix some nitrogen for those plants. If we have a fescue pasture, it can help dilute the effects of that toxic endophyte in the forage. So this can be another type of renovation that we can accomplish. And then finally, we can also have what we think of most often as renovation, which is the partial or complete destruction of whatever is there in the pasture, followed by a total reseeding. And usually this, of course, is kind of the last resort. It's a little bit more costly in terms of input, labor, time, etc. So we want to use this kind of as a last means or a last form of renovation. So how do we know what our pasture needs, what type of renovation we need? Should we just be making some management changes? Should we be doing this complete and total renovation, or what would be the best strategy? Well, in order to decide this, we need to use some quantifiable methods or measures of pasture condition. And what I mean by quantifiable is something that you can measure or count, or something objective that gives you a scale or an indicator to go off of. There are a few different types of these measures that we can utilize. I'm going to go over just a couple of them. There are other methods out there that are equally as capable. The first one that I'm going to mention is the step point method. And this is basically where we need to walk through each of our pastures in a random pattern. And every so often, say maybe every 20 or 30 steps, kind of depends on the size of the field. We look down at the tip of our shoe and we take note or make a record of whatever plant is there, or if there is a bare spot or a dirt or rock or etc. And if we record these observations, we can then use that to calculate something called the percent vegetative cover and also the percent of desirable forages. So this is just an example. You can see in the figure they have for pasture number 1, they went through this pasture and they counted 100 total random spots and marked exactly what was in each of those spots. They ended up with 34 marks for tall fescue, 3 orchard grass, 9 white clover, a few weeds, other desirable or undesirable plants, and then roughly a third of that was in bare ground or bare soil. So this allows us to calculate actually a percentage of our field in what is desirable. So like a tall fescue, orchard grass, clover, what is maybe an undesirable, like something like a weed, like buttercup, and what is bare ground, and gives us an idea of the health of that forage stand from an objective measure. And you can do this, for each of your fields. You can do this, as many times as you would like, but it just helps to give you kind of more of an objective measure of that pasture. Another one that's very similar to that is the NRCS has come up with what is called the Guide to Pasture Condition Scoring. And this is a very similar concept, but basically uses more indicators. So it uses the same desirable plants and percent cover using the same method as the step point method, but then it includes a number of other factors like how diverse is that pasture? Do we have grasses and legumes? Do we have any forbs? Do we have different types of grasses or different species? How vigorous are those forages? Do we have any legumes in there? Are there any signs of erosion in that pasture? And if you Google this Guide to Pasture Condition Scoring, it's a whole document. And they give you basically score marks that you can assign to your pasture for all of those different categories. And then you can tally all of those up and it will give you a suggestion for management changes. Is your pasture looking pretty good? You don't really need to make any changes at this time. Do we need a few minor improvements, doing some of those management changes, maybe frost seeding in a little clover, or do we need kind of some major renovation changes? So that's another option for assessing our pasture's condition. And then the third one I wanted to mention is kind of more specific to pugging, which is basically where, the hoofs of those animals are sinking into the ground when we have really wet conditions. This came about was brought to a lot of people's attention 2 years ago when we had that really wet season. But basically they made a scale specific to pugging damage, and it's used to quantify the severity of damage to the pasture based on two different factors. First, the amount of disturbance. So you can see in the picture on the right, of those 4 areas within that quadrat, one of them has a big livestock hoof print in it. The other 3 look like they're in relatively good condition. And then also the depth of that disturbance. Did those livestock's hooves sink really deep and make deep holes in that soil, or are they relatively shallow and might be easier to kind of fill back in quickly? And then they came up with a scoring system based on those 2 different factors. So you can see on the left, we have the different depths, and along the top, we have the percent of damage. And then you can use this to kind of look at the damage and see if, maybe you have more shallow pugging and it's only in a quarter of the area, you have really light damage, versus if you have, 3/4 of that quadrat that's damaged and they're 3 to 4 inches, that's much more severe of a damage. So these are all different tools that we have available to us that can be used to help assess the condition of our pasture and decide when we need to renovate or how much renovation we might need. If we put all of that together, we kind of say that if we have less than 30% of our pastures that are weeds or bare spots, bare ground, we have more of a light or very light damage. So in this case, some rest, some good management strategies, allowing that pasture to recover, giving it some extra time to regrow, maybe frost seeding in some clover to kind of fill in a few of those bare spots, will probably be sufficient as far as renovation. If we have more of a moderate damage situation where we have, 1/3 to half of the area that's in weeds or bare spots or undesirable forages, then that's maybe where we might want to start thinking about doing some overseeding. Maybe we don't necessarily want to totally kill everything that's there, but we want to fill in some of those bare areas. We could use a no-till drill for that. We could also do a little bit of light harrowing if we need to try to smooth it out, if there's been a lot of pugging damage, etc. And then if we have over 50% of that field that's completely bare soil or very weedy, taken over by undesirable forages, that's where we likely need some reestablishment of the field. One thing I will mention that is an option that is becoming increasing in popularity is that when it comes to like a total renovation situation, we can choose to go right back into a perennial desired forage crop, or some people are using things like annual forages to do a couple of cycles, help build some of that soil health, help alleviate some compaction, help take care of some of the weed issues if there are any, and then proceeding with planting back into a perennial crop. So there's a lot of different things to consider, but that's just kind of to give you a general overview of how to make some of those decisions as to when renovation may or may not be needed. So all that being said, the next thing is to plan ahead. Can't stress this enough. Everything we do in life, it's always usually better if we plan ahead. This is especially true for pasture renovations. It can take a long time for soil pH and fertility deficiencies to be corrected, especially for a no-till seeding. If we're not, tilling up that soil and able to incorporate our fertilizer or our lime into the soil using tillage, it can take a really long time to adjust that with lime. So it's always best to be planning ahead. And we also need to allow enough time for adequate weed control. Depending on how bad the weeds are in our field, sometimes a single, herbicide application may not be enough. We also need to realize that depending on the herbicide that we use, there may be a planting restriction following an herbicide application. So there's maybe a length of time where we can't plant after we've sprayed that herbicide. And so those are always things to consider and plan ahead for when we're making these renovation decisions. And then the other suggestion is, renovation is kind of an intensive process. There's a lot of steps. There's a lot of things to remember. There's a lot to keep track of. So it's best not to renovate everything all at one time. As nice as that would be, unless you have a way to keep your livestock completely off of your fields for, 6 months or more, that's not usually a feasible option. So it's best to go piece by piece and do this little by little. All right, so now we're going to talk, kind of move into the steps of pasture renovation and go through kind of consecutively all of the different steps that are involved in the renovation process. We're going to start with the soil because we know that without a healthy soil, we can't have good forages and good pastures. So really, I can't really stress enough that if you're going to do some renovation, you really need to be doing some soil testing and working to correct any fertility issues. Unless you're willing to apply, lime or fertilizer to help those forages get up and going, you're not going to have as good of a stand or as good of a pasture as you would like. So it's really important to be taking those soil tests and following the recommendations from that accordingly. So here's our next question. What is the first thing to check on a soil test? If you type just A, B, C, or D, A is for potassium, B is phosphorus, C is pH, and D is organic matter. So far we have 100% for soil pH. We'll give everybody a minute to get their answers in. All right, looks like everybody is saying soil pH, which means you guys are way ahead of me because that would be correct. That should be the first thing you look at. And that is because the soil pH affects the utilization of all of the other minerals. And we know that under acidic conditions or a low soil pH, some of those nutrients are not as available. Even if they're present in the soil, they may not be available for those plants to uptake those nutrients. So if you look at this figure on the right, you can see across the top we have a range of acidity from 5 all the way up to an alkaline soil at 9. And you can look at, say, for example, phosphorus and see that, when our soil pH gets below kind of that 6 or low 6s, any phosphorus that's in the soil is less available to those plants. So it's really important not only to consider, all of the essential nutrients, but also to look at the soil pH of that soil. pH is also one of the things that takes the longest to correct. Again, especially if it's surface applied and not incorporated into the soil with tillage. It can take, 6 months, a year, or even longer to really get that soil pH back up to where it needs to be. So it's always good to apply lime as early as possible if we have more acidic soils. But really, when we're talking pH, for most of our traditional, pasture forage grasses and legumes, the optimum pH usually falls between a 6 and a 7. So that's kind of a goal to shoot for. Another reason that pH is really important is acidic conditions also reduce root growth and development. So you can see from this image, on the left-hand side, we have a soil pH of 6.5, and you can see how long those roots are and how many smaller root hairs are coming off of the main root. And then when we get to a more acidic soil at either 5.2 or 5.5, we have much less root growth happening from those more acidic soils. So those roots, of course, will not be as able to extract nutrients or water from the soil. There will be less mineralization of organic nitrogen happening, less nitrogen fixation if we have legumes in our pastures. So another reason why soil pH is really an important thing to look at and to correct if it is too acidic. And then, of course, we know we have lots of other essential nutrients. Just to touch on a few, phosphorus we know is really critical for seedling development for those new seedlings. Potassium is really important for longevity and persistence of a stand, helping that stand monitor or weather different conditions and injuries, etc. And if anyone's ever heard of Liebig's law of the minimum, we know that, whatever the nutrient that is most deficient will be the limiting nutrients. So it's important to not only look at pH, but also all of these other nutrients as well, and make sure that we're having our soil fertility at an appropriate level. So fertility affects all of these different things: root growth, nutrient uptake, yield, stand vigor, persistence, all important things. So important step one is to fix that soil fertility and get that corrected. Here is a slide that I saw one of my colleagues, Dr. Dennis Hancock, use at one point. He said the most common cause of poor establishment in forages, soil pH and or fertility is too low. The most common cause of poor persistence in forages, soil pH and fertility is too low. And the most common cause of poor drought tolerance, you can guess, soil pH and or fertility is too low. So we spent a little while talking about it because it is so important for good forage management and good forage stands. Here is just a visual to kind of put that into perspective a little bit. This image came from a farm down in North Carolina, and the field on the left-hand side is a cool season annual pasture mix that was planted into freshly cleared ground, and they basically just added no fertility. They didn't add anything to that soil. The picture on the right is the exact same farm, exact same mix that was planted, exact same soil type, but they added nutrients based on the soil test. So you can see the difference. It's really important to work on fixing that soil fertility. Without a test, it's just a guess. So take those soil tests. If there's one thing that you take away from today, it's take your soil test and get that soil fertility to a level where it needs to be. All right, moving on to step two is weeds, everyone's favorite topic, right? So I was just curious, does anybody know what weeds they routinely see in their pastures, what weeds they have problems with, what's problematic in your area? Buttercups, it's a really common one. We had a lot of those, especially this last year, and they're very distinctive, so they're easily recognizable. Lots of buttercup issues. That makes sense. I've had a lot of questions on buttercup this year. Thistle is another one. Pigweed, thistle. Okay, so, a variety of different weeds. Foxtail. These are all, common weeds that can cause problems in a pasture that are, not alone on your farms. They're seen, across the state and across the region. The reason that these weeds are problematic is they compete with our forages that we want to grow for things like light, nutrients, moisture, space, and they can shade out whatever desirable crop that we have planted that is growing underneath of those weeds. So it's really important when we're doing a new planting or a new seeding that we control those weeds prior to planting and get those under control so they're not a detriment. As an example, this is a field that I worked on when I was a graduate student in Minnesota. This was obviously, as you can see from the image, a freshly planted field. If you look closely in between those rows, you can see all those tiny little weed seedlings that are popping up. We had a lot of lamb's quarter and pigweed in this field. It was a new field that was just acquired and just freshly planted, as you can see. Well, what happened was the weeds, for one reason or another, the weeds got really ahead of us, and this is how that field ended up turning out looking like. It was completely taken over by pigweed and lamb's quarter. You can see some of the forages there trying to come up through, and we actually had to go through and clear those out. So this is what a plot was that was halfway weeded. And you can see the effect of those weeds on the forages underneath. If we hadn't been, getting rid of those weeds and taking them out, those weeds would have completely shaded out and probably killed the forages that we planted underneath. So, it's not always this extreme. Oftentimes, it's to a lesser extent, but they can get on top of you and get ahead of you really quickly. So it's important to consider that and make sure that we've taken the proper steps to control those weeds ahead of time. If we're looking for ways to identify weeds, there are several universities that have really good weed ID guides online. Virginia Tech is one of them. There's also the Mid-Atlantic Field Crop weed management guide that has lots of good information on weed management and specific, herbicide recommendations for different weeds, etc. And of course, you can always reach out to your extension agents, extension specialists, other people who are here to help. One other thing that I wanted to mention for when it comes to weed control is, we don't always need to rely just on an herbicide when it comes to controlling weeds. We know that there are several strategies. Cultural weed control is basically, maintaining a healthy forage stand that will outcompete those weeds. So going back to what we were talking about earlier, using good grazing management practices, using good harvest management in our hay fields, keeping that soil at a proper level that is well fertilized. We know that these weeds are very opportunistic and they will often come up if given the chance. So if we don't give them a chance, we'll usually have less of a weed problem. We also have mechanical control, using things like clipping or mowing to eliminate the seed heads or cut those weeds off before they're able to produce seed. If you're using tillage when you're doing some pasture renovation, that is another form of mechanical weed control. And then, of course, our chemical control options with herbicides. I can't really get into exactly what herbicide is the best because this will depend on the weeds that you have present in your field. But again, reach out to some of your extension folks that are able to help you with herbicide choices. As far as timing, usually spring is the best time to control some of our annual weeds. These weeds are a little bit smaller and more susceptible. They're just getting going. We usually want to wait until the temperature, is a little bit warm, above 50 degrees for a couple days, until those weeds really start growing. And that's a good time to spray some of those annual weeds. If we have a lot of perennial or biennial weeds, like thistle was mentioned, thistle is a perennial weed. Usually fall is a better time to spray these because those weeds are basically translocating nutrients and energy down into their root system to prepare for winter. So if we hit them in the fall, they not only translocate nutrients down into those roots, but they translocate that herbicide down into the roots as well. That helps kill the plants and control them a little bit better. So again, it depends what type of weeds you have. So we really should be good about scouting and learning what types of weeds we have in our pasture so that we can better control them. The third step is to choose well-adapted species. So what I mean by that is we want to match the plants that we're going to be planting to not only our farm, but also our soil and our site characteristics. Some of these characteristics include things like different soil types, different soil drainage, moisture holding capacity, what the fertility of our soil is, the pH, the topography, etc. We know that different forages grow better under different conditions. For an example, this is just kind of a broad summary, but we have several different species of grasses listed on the far right. And then in the other columns, you can see where these species fall as far as how they tolerate drainage. So VPD is very poorly drained, PD is poorly drained, SPD somewhat poorly drained, and MWD is moderately well drained. As far as fertility, medium to high fertility for all of these different ones, some variation. And then of course soil pH. So if we have a really acidic soil that's very, very poorly drained and has low fertility, we're not necessarily going to be able to plant something like an orchard grass that needs that pH to be a little bit higher to thrive, versus something like a fescue can tolerate a little bit lower soil pH, a more poorly drained soil. It's more tolerant of those conditions. And the same exact thing can be said for different legume species. Again, this is just an overview of some different species and what they're kind of more or less tolerant to. Something like an alfalfa, we know is really not tolerant of a low pH at all. So if you have a pH, in the 5s and you're intending on planting alfalfa, it's really not going to do very well. It needs high fertility, it needs well-drained soils, and it needs a higher soil pH. So knowing those soil conditions can also help us in our decisions when it comes to choosing what to plant. We also need to, in addition to thinking about the soil or the site, match our forages to our intended use. And by intended use, I mean things like hay versus pasture. Is this a permanent field versus kind of more of a temporary mix or something to get you through? Is this, what time of year is it? Are we trying to graze more in the summer, graze more in the fall? What sort of management system are we using? We know that we have, cool season species, we have warm season species. Cool season, of course, thrive in our cooler, wetter climates. They're kind of more predominant in our region, but we do also have some warm season species, or some people plant some fields in each. So they have, some fields that they can graze in the spring when the cool seasons are growing well, then they switch to the warm season fields in the summer, and then back to the cool season fields in the fall. Some grow best at different temperatures. And then there's just a few examples of each of those. So that's one thing to consider. Here in, Delaware and Maryland, we're kind of in the transition zone. We have more cool season species than warm season, but we can utilize some of each of those. We also have things like bunch grasses versus sod grasses. So a bunch grass is something that grows in more of a tufted growth habit, like the picture that you see in the bottom left corner. And a sod grass is something that has a lateral growth habit. So it can spread or fill in some of those bare areas using either above ground, which would be called like stolons, or below ground, which would be called rhizomes. You can see a picture of that in the bottom right-hand corner. So a sod grass can fill into some of those bare spots, while a bunch grass won't necessarily. A bunch grass is usually a higher yielding forage because it grows really tall and really big. You get that big, like heavy growth, but it's not quite as tolerant of closer grazing. Whereas a sod grass is a little bit lower yielding usually, but it is usually a little bit more tolerant of closer grazing. So that's another important consideration, is to know what type of species we're planting and what growth habit that species has. Anybody know which common cool season grass is a sod former? A, B, C, D, or E, tall fescue, orchard grass, bluegrass, timothy, or none of the above? We have a few guesses for bluegrass, at least one guess for tall fescue. Those of you who are guessing C, bluegrass, are correct. That bluegrass is a sod former. Although I will say that tall fescue can sometimes get shorter rhizomes. It's technically a bunch grass, but it also kind of is an intermediary species. So it can have some rhizomes that form occasionally. So good job, everybody's doing well. And then of course we know we have differences between our grasses and our legumes. Grasses are usually, when it comes to the nutrient content, a little bit lower in protein, and some of the essential minerals like calcium has a little bit lower caloric value and is a little bit higher in fiber. Legumes would be kind of the opposite. Legumes also tend to have a higher feed intake. Usually they're more preferable, and animals tend to consume more of them. They're also capable of fixing nitrogen, so that's an added benefit of having legumes in our pasture. And then, the appearances, kind of you can see there, grasses are usually a little bit more leafy. Legumes like the alfalfa you see in the bottom right corner usually tend to have a little bit more of like a tree-like appearance. And when it comes to these legumes, this is a picture showing kind of the ranges in relative forage quality. So just kind of a base measure of overall forage quality. This data came from the University of Georgia Forage Testing Lab. And I wanted to show you this figure for two reasons. One, to say, even though, you may hear that, one species is much higher in forage quality than another, another might be really low compared to something else. Well, there is always a range in forage quality, even within the same type of species. So, if we have something like our fescue or orchard grass, which is like our common, cool season perennial forages, even though, we may have an average where that, green bar is, we have a wide range. And this depends on so many different factors: soil fertility, management, maturity, etc. So there's always going to be a range. But in general, you can kind of see the trend for the cool season perennials. Here's our warm season perennials like Bahia grass and Bermuda grass compared to our legumes. So you can see that trend of legumes tending to be a little bit higher in forage quality. Again, there is always a range with And then finally, the third consideration when selecting species is we want to match our plants or our forages to the requirements of our livestock. We said at the beginning, we all have quite a variety of different livestock species. They may be at different life stages. We may have different numbers, different ages, etc. So that's really important to consider as well. This is, again, looking at relative forage quality along that x-axis along the bottom. And we know that as we go through different stages of species, they may require different levels of quality in their diet to be able to grow and thrive and do well. So for example, here at the bottom, we may have like an idle horse or a dry cow, heifer that's just growing. If you have those two little ponies that you see up in the top picture there, they really don't need a high forage quality in their pasture, right? We want something for them to graze, we want something for them to eat, but we don't really want to provide them with too much quality to get into some of those metabolic issues. In the middle, we know we may have things like a really hardworking horse, a lactating beef cow, kind of a heifer. Those kinds of species, require a little bit more in forage quality than, the dry cow or the idle horse, of course. And then at the top of the spectrum, of course, our high producing dairy cows. Also, if we have any like stocker cattle that are, really in that heavy growth phase, we're trying to like put, meat and fat and muscle on those animals to get them to grow and finish. Those will require a higher forage quality also. So it's important to think about these ranges in what these requirements are for our different animal species when we're picking our forages. Once we've decided on what forages we're going to plant, if we have legumes that we're going to include in our mix, it's really important that we make sure our legume seeds are inoculated. Basically, a lot of the legumes that we buy these days comes pre-inoculated. So, this will save you some time, helps make sure that things are inoculated. They're coated with basically an inert material, usually includes some lime in it. It's just to kind of help the seed get up and going really quickly. If they're not inoculated, we should be sure that we inoculate those legume seeds before seeding. We also need to use some sort of adhesive material to kind of stick that inoculant to those seeds. A lot of people use sugar water, just a 1-to-1 ratio of sugar and water. And really, the reason behind this is these inoculants are living organisms. And, all of those legume species have that symbiotic relationship with the bacteria that allows them to fix that nitrogen and have those root nodules. And inoculants are only going to work if the bacteria are alive when it's applied. So, we want to make sure we're using our proper storage and handling, check the expiration dates, make sure it's not expired, because otherwise, if we're applying inoculant that looks like this, it may not be quite as successful as if we have live and living inoculant. I also just wanted to mention, if you are getting your own inoculant, there are specific relationships with specific rhizobia bacteria based on the type or the species of legumes. So it's important to make sure that we're getting the appropriate strain. If we have a clover versus an alfalfa versus a soybean, etc. So just something to be aware of if you're getting your own inoculant for your legume seeds. All right, the next step is to graze or clip the pastures close. This is the only time when it comes to forage management or pasture management when you'll hear me say that overgrazing should be done or it can be beneficial. And this is because we want to suppress the competition from what is currently in that field so that it's not overshadowing and choking out any new seeds that we're trying to get up and going. It also helps to eliminate any residue on the surface, so we can get that good seed to soil contact. We'll talk about seed to soil contact a little more in a minute. But basically, we want to get a kind of close, so we're eliminating that thatch or that residue on the soil surface. I will say, when you are doing something like this, be mindful of the effects of overgrazing on animal performance. If you do have one of those, stocker cattle that you're trying to get really good growth on, and you're going to make them graze it down to nothing, the forage quality is going to deplete pretty quickly, and they might not be getting the nutrition that they need from that field. So one thing to be aware of when you are doing this. The Next step is to prepare a proper seed bed. We're going to talk about first a tilled seeding and then second a no-till seeding. There are, of course, advantages and disadvantages to both types of seedings. For a tilled seeding, the advantages are that we can loosen the soil with the tillage. It helps eliminate any existing vegetation, turn under some of those weed seeds, incorporates our fertilizer into the soil, and creates kind of a nice smooth surface for planting. However, I will say that we can underwork or overwork the soil when it comes to tillage. So if it's underworked or not tilled enough, we'll have a lot of surface residue left. It's going to be really rough or clumpy, hard to get good seed placement in that soil. On the flip side, if we have an overworked seeding, it can be too fluffy or too fine, which really makes it kind of dry out quicker. And there's a lot of potential for surface crusting. So it might rain, it will dry out really quickly, and we'll get a crust over the top of that surface. And I'll show you a picture of that in a minute. But really the important thing is we want our seed bed to be soft yet firm. And we want it to be firm enough that, if we walk across the field, our boot tracks maybe sink in just a little bit, a quarter of an inch into that soil, but not super deep. Then it's been overworked if you're sinking in very deep. So just to put some visuals behind that, these pictures are with corn, but the concept is the same. If we have an underworked seed bed, you can see, that in this picture, it's really rough, really cloddy. We have a hard time getting, that good seed to soil contact in that photo. On the flip side, if it's overworked, it has the potential for that crusting. You can see they've pulled the crust back, and this plant was having a really hard time kind of poking through that crust of that soil surface. And then here, we want like a nice soft yet firm seed bed for our forage plantings. When it comes to no-till seedings, the advantages of no-till are things like it's a little bit less labor intensive. You have one less trip across the field because you're not doing any of that tillage. It's really good for conserving, soil integrity, moisture, reducing the potential for that soil to erode. So from a soil health standpoint, no-till seedings are becoming more and more popular, and they work, just as well if done properly as a tilled seed bed. So there are, of course, like I said, advantages to each type. If we're using a no-till seeding, it is really important, especially important to suppress the existing stand and reduce that residue. So, grazing it close or mowing it, clipping that forage off so that we get rid of that thatch layer. And then we also might want to use some sort of non-selective herbicide to suppress the existing stand. We really need to basically ensure that the seed is going to reach the soil and not get stuck in the thatch layer or the residue that's laying on top of that soil surface if we're planting into it. So something to remember and keep in mind when we're using no-till seedings. All right, so moving on to seeding at the proper time. Can anybody say when is the best time of year to seed? A, B, C, or D, spring, summer, fall, or any time? I kind of gave this answer away a little bit at the beginning when I said this is a good time of year to be talking about this. Yeah, usually fall is a good time of the year to do our forage seedings. That kind of late summer or fall, like now, mid-August, mid-September. The advantages to seeding at this time are there's usually less weed competition happening. The weather is cooler, so, especially for those cool season forages, they do better and they have more growth happening in the fall season. One possible disadvantage is sometimes we can have a lack of moisture. We saw that last year when it was really dry, through basically the entire month of September. Nothing was growing, so that is a risk. But usually the advantages outweigh the risks for that fall seeding. A spring seeding is also feasible. In the Maryland, Delaware area, this would be, sometime around March-ish, depending on the year. Advantages are there's usually more moisture around in the spring, but on the flip side, there can be too much moisture, and that can, delay our seeding if we're not able to get into the fields and get those things in the ground. It usually tends to, if we get it too late in the spring, it gets kind of hotter and drier, and that can put a lot of stress on those newly establishing stands. And then we usually oftentimes have more pressure from things like our summer annual weeds that are also getting up and growing in the spring. Of course, those are all for cool season forages. If we're planting warm season forages, we want to plant them in the summer once we have appropriate soil temperatures for those seeds to germinate and grow, because they don't do well in the cool weather. They're a warm season forage. One other type of seeding that might be of interest is frost seeding, which basically means broadcasting or spreading seed onto the soil surface in late winter. So, like sometime in February. This doesn't work very well for a lot of our grasses and for alfalfa, but it can be really successful with clover. One thing that you really need is a freeze-thaw cycle, which basically means the soil is, heaving and thawing and heaving and thawing, and that kind of working of the soil with that freeze-thaw basically works that seed into the ground just enough to get some seed to soil contact. And this is usually, like I said, more successful with clover, so that's kind of really one of the only forages that is used for this method. One important thing is to make sure that we're not having a forage stand that's going to outcompete that clover. We want to use it for, if there are bare areas, or, maybe graze ahead of time, right before we're going to seed, to make sure that we're not having existing vegetation that will outcompete the new clover. Okay, one of we're almost done. One of the next steps is to seed at the proper rate. The reason this is so important is our seed characteristics vary a lot depending on what type of forage we're planting. So we have, compact and smooth seeds like alfalfa, which you see in the top picture, versus kind of broader and flatter seeds like our orchard grass, which you see in the bottom picture. We also have larger seed and smaller seeds. So tall fescue, which is on the left side, is a much larger seed compared to timothy, which is on the right side. So, the rate of these different seeds and the speed at which they're going to go through the drill or the broadcast spreader will vary a lot depending on the size and the type and the structure of those seeds. So it's really, really important to be aware of this when we're thinking about seeding rates. Even within the same type of species, we can have different seed characteristics. So these pictures are each 200,000 seeds of an annual ryegrass. On the left is a variety that's a tetraploid annual ryegrass. On the right is a variety that's a diploid. And you can see with the exact same number of seeds, the difference in the volume between those two forage varieties. So, not only is species make a difference and type of seed, but also there are differences in varieties. If there's coating or not on the seed, all of those things can play a difference. So it's important to take all those into consideration when we're looking at seeding rates. And then we need to adjust our seeding rate based on, some different things like our planting method. If we're using a drill, we want to go kind of probably at the lower end of the seeding, the recommended seeding range. If we're using a broadcast seeder or, broadcasting that seed onto the surface, there's usually a little bit lower seed to soil contact with that method. So we want to use maybe a little bit on the higher end of the seeding range, the recommended range. We can also adjust our seeding rate a little bit based on our conditions. So if conditions are optimum, you have like well-drained soil and good soil moisture and not a lot of weed pressure and good seed to soil contact, then, obviously you can put a little less seed in the ground. If we have, poor conditions, like it's really dry or we have some weed pressure or we're worried about the thatch on the soil surface, then we might want to go a little bit on the higher end of that range. Either way, no matter what, I really emphasize we need to be calibrating our drills or our seeders. And it's really important that we're knowing exactly how much seed we're putting in the ground. I have seen plenty of people where they thought that they had everything calibrated. They bought this amount of seed that they needed. They start planting. They're 3/4 of the way through the field and they ran out of seed. So they have to make a trip back to the store to get more seed. It's that additional expense. So it's really important, from a monetary standpoint as well as from a forage standpoint to be calibrating our seeding drills and our seeding equipment. This is just like some really general recommendations for seeding rates. Another consideration is if we have a pure stand versus a mixture. Of course, if we're mixing different seed together, we want to reduce the seeding rate of each of those components because we're including more than just that one thing. So usually the seeding rate of each component will be reduced by maybe 30 to 40% if we're seeding it in a mixture. All right, and then the last thing is to seed at the proper depth. So we need to adjust our drill so that it's planting those seeds at the right depth. We already talked about all the differences between those seed characteristics. Some seeds are larger and they need to be planted a little deeper. Some seeds are smaller and they need to be planted a little shallower. We also need to take into account the type of soil, the texture of that soil, if it's a really sandy soil or more clay soil, the moisture content of that soil, and if we need any weight or pressure to cut through the sod or the existing vegetation that's present. In general, for most of our cool season perennial forages like orchard grass, fescue, etc., the ideal depth is generally 1/4 to 1/2 inch. If we have a heavier soil with higher moisture, we want to place that seed a little shallower. If we have a lighter soil with lower moisture, we want to place that seed just a little bit deeper. Question is, after seeding, should you be able to see any seed on the soil surface? A is no seed should be visible. B is yes, 10% of the seed should be visible. C is yes, 20% of the seed should be visible. And D is yes, you should be able to see almost all of the seed on that soil surface. Okay, we have a few answers for both B and C. So 10 to 20% of the seed should be visible. Half and half, 50-50 split. So that is basically correct. So you do want to see some seed on top of the ground. I say usually kind of that 10%-ish range. The reason this is because seeding too deep is really one of the most common causes behind establishment failures. If you put that seed too deep in the soil, even if it has enough moisture and it germinates and it starts to grow, if it doesn't reach the surface before the energy within that seed runs out, it's going to die and not be able to produce a plant from that seed. So we really want to make sure that while we do need good seed to soil contact, we're also not seeding those seeds too deep so they have enough time to reach the surface before the energy within that seed runs out and the plant's able to start that photosynthetic process. Okay, so then the last step basically is kind of more of a management step. We need to be sure to manage that stand while it's establishing. We want to avoid grazing until we have sufficient root systems that have been developed. One option for doing this is to let those newly established forages grow to maybe a foot tall and then mow them off or cut them down to like that 4-inch height and repeat this a couple times. This will encourage those plants to set down roots without having the pressure of livestock grazing it. Especially horses are notorious for being aggressive grazers, and we don't want them to be able to pull those new seedlings out from the ground. So we want to be able to get those roots well established before we do that. And the other advantage of mowing is if we do have some of those weeds that are coming up and trying to outcompete our forages, that will help give our newly planted forages kind of more of a fighting chance for that. And then one other caution is to avoid grazing our newer stands if it's ever like really wet. If we have a really wet period, we have a lot of rain in the forecast, we have really wet soils, try to plant it so we can move our livestock off of that new seeding so we can avoid damaging it as much as possible. One other consideration that I'm not really going to get a lot into is the endophyte infected tall fescue or Kentucky 31. For anyone who's not familiar, this basically has a fungus that lives inside the plant between the cells of that plant. And the benefit of the fungus is that it has a symbiotic relationship with the plant and it produces alkaloids which protect the plant. So it makes it more hardy, makes it more able to withstand drought, makes it more tolerant and sturdy. But on the flip side, we have a lot of negative effects of that alkaloid on our livestock when it's consumed by the livestock. The reason I mention this is because of that relationship between the fungus and the plant. The tall fescue, the toxic tall fescue, can be more persistent or harder to eliminate. So sometimes in that case, that's where, I mentioned at the beginning, sometimes people like to do a rotation or two of annuals to kind of get the field cleaned up. There's something called the spray, smother, spray method, which basically involves rotating the livestock, or rotating through a couple of different annual forages before planting back into a perennial mix. So if you have something that's really hard to get rid of, like a Kentucky 31 or a toxic tall fescue, that is something to consider in the renovation process. This is different from any of the novel endophytes or endophyte-free tall fescue. If you're worried about it, there is a test you can do to figure out which type of fescue you have. But I just wanted to throw that out there. Here's kind of what the spray, smother, spray method would look like. If you have a calendar year across the bottom, you may spray that off, in the springtime, plant something like a summer annual as kind of a smother crop that will, produce a forage, and you can graze or harvest that forage and utilize it during those summer months. Then you'll have a second spray kind of in that late summer, fall time, and then you plant your, desired forage into that after that. You can do as many cycles of annuals as you want. You can do another smother crop in the fall to overwinter, another one the following summer, and make it kind of, a year and a half or a 2-year cycle rather than just a one season. It kind of depends on how long or how tough that, fescue stand is to get rid of. So just wanted to mention that as another consideration. And finally, I always suggest to use recommended varieties. There are varieties that are, better and worse than other ones. And really the only way to know is to look at some of the variety trial data. University of Kentucky and Penn State both have variety trials that have been established for a long, long time. So you can reference those. I did just start this last year some orchard grass varieties at the University of Maryland. This is its first growing season, so I don't have any data yet, but I will soon. And then make sure you're using, certified seeds. So we want, seed that's pure and of good quality, and it's not going to have a lot of, contaminants or weeds, etc., that are mixed in there. So here is a list of kind of the most common establishment mistakes. We've covered all of these things. Be sure we're, doing our soil testing and we're liming and fertilizing. Make sure our weeds are under control before we go to plant. Make sure we're preparing that seed bed properly. We're planting at the right time of year, and we're using the right planting rate and planting depth. If all of those factors are aligned, sometimes things happen. We can still get uncooperative weather. But hopefully, if we've done our homework and we've done our proper planning, we can avoid things like this image, and we can get a good stand established. With that, I did put my contact information on the last slide, so feel free to reach out if you have questions. I know you can also reach out to Dan or Susan or other people at the University of Delaware as well.